The day my mother-in-law threw my daughter's birthday cake in the trash was the day I finally understood that some wars don't start with screaming, they start with silence and a smile, and a woman who has spent 30 years perfecting both. My name is Jennifer Caldwell. I live in a 7,000 square foot brownstone in Lincoln Park, Chicago, with my husband, Preston Caldwell. Yes, that Preston Caldwell, the one whose face appears on the side of buses advertising Caldwell and Associates, the most aggressive real estate development firm on the North Shore. We have a daughter named Jenna, 14 years old, bright as a lighthouse and twice as stubborn. And for 3 days straight, she had been up past midnight in our kitchen, piping buttercream roses onto a 4-layer lemon cake she built entirely from scratch. She had watched 11 YouTube tutorials, she had burned her first attempt completely, she had cried, started over, and refused every offer of help because she wanted it to be hers. The frosting on top read, in careful pink script, "Favorite Aunt." That aunt was my sister-in-law, Reese, Preston's younger sister, the only person in that entire family who had ever looked at my daughter like she was something worth seeing. And Patricia Caldwell, 71 years old, Park Avenue posture, Chanel number 5 like a weapon, picked up that cake, walked to the kitchen, and dropped it directly into the stainless steel trash can without a word of warning. Then she turned around, patted Jenna on the cheek, and said, "No one is going to eat it, sweetie." Like it was nothing, like my child was nothing. The whole room froze, and then my husband stood up. I want you to hold that image for just a second, because what Preston did next is the thing that split my life into a before and an after, the thing that made me realize I had been living inside a story I didn't write and didn't choose, and that every person sitting around that dining room table in our Lincoln Park home that Sunday afternoon had known a version of that story except me. We had 20 people at that birthday lunch. Preston's entire family, his mother Patricia, his aunt Sylvia, who flew in from Scottsdale, his cousin Bryce, who worked for the firm, Reese herself, and a rotating cast of country club acquaintances who arrived with hostess gifts and left with gossip. My own family was there too. My mother, Helen, who had driven up from Naperville and was already uncomfortable the second she walked through the door, and my younger brother Todd, who never liked Preston and had the good manners to pretend otherwise. We had a catering team in the kitchen, we had a bartender, we had fresh peonies from stems on the table, and a playlist I had spent 2 hours curating. I had done everything right. I always did everything right. And Jenna had carried her cake out from the kitchen on a wooden board, both arms shaking slightly from the weight, this enormous, beautiful, imperfect, completely genuine thing she had made for a woman she loved, and Patricia had destroyed it in less than 4 seconds. My husband stood up, and every single person at that table went perfectly still. Preston Caldwell is 6'2", silver-templed, the kind of man who commands rooms without trying, because every room he has ever entered has already been arranged in his favor. He pushed back his chair slowly, he straightened his blazer, and then he said, I need you to understand how calm he was when he said this, how completely, chillingly calm. Mom did the right thing. Jenna, go upstairs. Just like that. 6 words. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement that our 14-year-old daughter was standing there with her hands still dusted in powdered sugar, watching the people who were supposed to love her choose sides in under a second. Jenna looked at me. I looked at her. And I said, in a voice I didn't recognize as my own, "Go ahead, baby. I'll be up in a minute." She went. She didn't cry until she was on the stairs, and she waited until she thought no one could hear her. I could hear her. Here is what nobody at that table knew about me yet. I had been keeping notes 11 months. Not because I suspected anything specific. At first it was just a habit I'd developed in therapy. My therapist, Dr. Okafar, had suggested journaling as a way to process what she called my pattern of self-erasure inside my marriage, which was her very professional way of saying that I had spent a decade making myself smaller and smaller to fit inside the shape Preston needed me to be. But the journaling became something else when I started noticing things. Small things at first. A dinner reservation I hadn't made, a weekend trip Preston took to Phoenix for a land deal that I couldn't find any record of when I looked through his shared calendar. a perfume I didn't own on the collar of a shirt that had already been dry cleaned, and Patricia, always Patricia, showing up at our house unannounced on the specific days Preston was away, staying for hours, talking about nothing, watching me with those flat gray eyes like she was waiting for something. I started writing it all down. Dates, times, details. The things people say when they think you're not listening, and the things they very specifically don't say. 11 months of notes, saved in a password-protected folder on a laptop that lived at the bottom of my gym bag, not in our home office, not connected to any family account, not anywhere Preston or his mother could accidentally stumble across it. I hadn't known what I was building. That afternoon, watching my daughter's cake disappear into the trash, I understood exactly what I had. The party dissolved within the hour. People made excuses, early flights, babysitters, a headache, so sorry, and peeled away from the table with that particular social grace that wealthy people deploy when they need to pretend they didn't witness something ugly. My mother hugged me in the foyer for longer than usual and whispered, "Call me tonight," into my hair. Todd shook Preston's hand with both of his, which is something Todd only does when he's furious and trying not to show it. Reese was the last to leave, and she stopped in front of me in the entryway with her car keys in her hand and her eyes full of something that looked very much like guilt. And she said, "Jennifer, I'm so sorry about the cake." And I said, "Don't apologize for things that aren't your fault." And she looked at me for a long moment and said, very quietly, "What if some of it is?" I didn't know what to do with that, so I filed it, straight into the mental folder marked, "Things I will come back to." I went upstairs to Jenna first. Always Jenna first. She was lying on her bed with her headphones on, staring at the ceiling, the way teenagers do when they're feeling something too big to talk about yet. I sat down beside her. She pulled one headphone off. I said, "I'm sorry that happened." She said, "It's fine, Mom." It was not fine, and we both knew it, but she is 14, and she learned very early that certain feelings are safer kept behind glass in this house, which is something I hate myself for allowing. I told her the cake was beautiful. I told her Aunt Reese knew how hard she'd worked. I told her that what Grandma Patricia did was wrong, plain and simple, no dressing it up. Jenna looked at me and said, "Why does Dad always take her side?" And I said, "I don't know yet, baby, but I'm going to find out." It was the most honest thing I had said inside that house in years. I kissed her forehead. I went back downstairs. Preston was in his study with the door closed, which was normal, except that he was on the phone and he had lowered his voice when he heard my footsteps in the hallway, which was something I had been clocking for months. I didn't stop. I kept walking to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of Sancerre, and sat at the island while the catering team quietly packed up around me. One of the servers, a young woman named Dana, who I recognized from previous events, caught my eye and gave me a small, sympathetic nod. I nodded back. Even the help knew what this family was. That night, after Preston fell asleep, I opened my laptop. I read through 11 months of notes like I was reading someone else's life, because in a lot of ways, I was. The woman in those notes had been slowly, methodically, almost surgically removed from her own existence. She had stopped attending her book club because Preston thought it took too much of her time. She had let her interior design work, actual paying clients, actual professional reputation reduce itself to a hobby, and then to nothing, because Preston's schedule needed to be the priority, and someone had to be home. She had smiled at parties and laughed at dinners and worn the right things and said the appropriate words, and all the while the walls were closing in, inch by inch, in a way that was so gradual you could almost convince yourself it wasn't happening. Almost. The Phoenix trip in March. I cross-referenced it that night against the credit card statements I had requested paper copies of. Preston didn't know I still received paper statements because Patricia had suggested years ago that we go paperless, and I had smiled and said absolutely, and never actually changed the mailing address for my secondary account that was still technically a joint account even though neither of us had touched it in years. A hotel in Scottsdale. 4 nights. The room rate was listed as a double occupancy upgrade. Preston had told me he was staying with Bryce. Bryce had been at our dining room table that afternoon. I had watched him eat 2 servings of the roasted salmon. He lives in a studio apartment in Wicker Park. He doesn't own a home in Scottsdale. He has never owned a home in Scottsdale. I opened a new document. I started a new list. This one wasn't about Preston. This one was about Patricia. Because here is what I had started to understand. Sitting at my kitchen island at 2 in the morning with a half-empty wine glass and 11 months of receipts and dates and lowered voices. Patricia Caldwell was not a difficult mother-in-law. She was not overbearing in the usual way, not the cliché of a woman who couldn't let go of her son. She was something more specific, more calculated, more cold. She had spent a decade managing me, managing what I knew, what I saw, what I was allowed to become inside this family. The unannounced visits weren't loneliness, they were surveillance. The suggestions about my career, about Jenna's school, about which friends of mine were the right fit for our social circle, those weren't opinions, they were architecture. She had been building walls around me for 10 years and calling them love. And my husband had been handing her the bricks. The question that kept me up until 4 in the morning was not whether Preston was having an affair. I was almost certain he was, and honestly, that almost felt like the smaller betrayal at that point. The question that kept pulling at something cold and specific in the center of my chest was why? Why the secrecy? Why the control? Why did Patricia need me contained so badly? What was I close to knowing? What had I almost stumbled into on accident that had made this family so invested in keeping me distracted, kept small, kept grateful? I thought about what Reese had said on her way out. What if some of it is? I thought about Reese's face when she said it. The guilt, yes, but something else underneath it. Something that looked, if I'm being honest, like relief. Like a woman who had been waiting for someone to finally start asking the right questions. I texted her at 4:17 in the morning. I said, "We need to talk. Not at the house, not anywhere Preston would know about." She replied in under a minute. She had been awake. She said, "I've been waiting 2 years for you to say that." I closed my laptop. I finished my wine. I looked around my beautiful, expensive, immaculate kitchen. The Calicut marble counters, the Sub-Zero refrigerator, the custom cabinetry that had cost more than my first car, and I felt something shift inside me. Not break, not collapse. Shift. Like the ground under a glacier that is very, very slowly beginning to move. I had spent a decade being the perfect wife in this house, quiet, gracious, available, grateful. I had shrunk myself into a shape that fit the frame they built for me and told myself it was love. It was time to find out what was actually inside the walls. Reese picked me up 3 blocks from the house at 9 the next morning. I had told Preston I was doing a Pilates class downtown. He hadn't looked up from his phone. That was the thing about being invisible. It had its advantages, right at the end. She drove a black Audi, no plates I recognized, and when I got in, she handed me a coffee and didn't say anything for the first 4 blocks. Then she said, "How much do you already know?" And I said, "Enough to know there's more." She nodded like that was exactly the right answer and drove us to a coffee shop in Andersonville that neither of us had ever been to together, that had no association with any Caldwell event or contact. That was exactly the kind of anonymous, warm, ordinary place where the truth apparently needed to be told. She talked for 2 hours. I did not interrupt her once. Here is what Reese told me, and I am going to give it to you straight, the way she gave it to me, because there is no gentle version of this, and I am done performing gentleness for people who don't deserve it. Preston had been in a relationship, not a casual affair, a relationship, 3 years, continuous, with a woman named Sloan, who was a commercial real estate attorney in Phoenix, which explained the Scottsdale trips, the lowered voice calls, the land deal weekends that never produced any land deals. Sloan was not a secret to Patricia. Patricia had met Sloan. Patricia liked Sloan. And here was the part that landed on me like a physical weight. Patricia had been facilitating it, covering for the trips, creating reasons for Preston to travel, making sure I was managed, kept busy, kept slightly off balance, never quite settled enough to look too hard at anything. But Reese wasn't done. "Jennifer," she said, wrapping both hands around her mug, "the firm is in trouble. Caldwell and Associates, the name on the buses, the name I had married into, the name on our mailbox and on Jenna's school forms, had been in serious financial distress for 18 months. A series of development deals that had gone sideways, a zoning lawsuit in the South Loop that had cost them 8 figures. Preston had been quietly restructuring debt, moving assets, doing things with the company's finances that Reese, who held a minority stake left to her by their father, had become aware of only recently because she had hired her own accountant to review her dividends, and the numbers had stopped making sense. She had confronted Preston 6 months ago. He had told her she was confused. He had told her to leave the business side to him. He had told her that their mother agreed and that Reese should focus on her own life. What he had not told her was that the asset restructuring involved moving significant company funds into accounts that were not in the company's name. And several of those accounts, I felt the room tilt slightly when she said this, were in Patricia's name. And one of them, a real estate holding LLC that existed only on paper, was established 3 years ago with 2 initial members, Preston Caldwell and Sloan. Not Jennifer Caldwell, not his wife of 13 years, not the woman who was a co-signer on the original firm incorporation documents, which meant that if the firm had significant undisclosed liabilities, I was potentially exposed too, but I had no access to the assets that had been quietly moved out of reach. "He's been planning an exit," Reese said. Her voice was flat, tired. "From the firm, from the liability, and I think, Jennifer, from you." I sat with that for a long moment. The coffee shop hummed around us. Someone's toddler laughed at the next table. Outside the window, Andersonville went about its cheerful, oblivious Tuesday morning. "How long have you known?" I asked. "The financial piece, 6 months," she said. "The full picture, everything I just told you, 3 weeks." 3 weeks, I said. "I was scared," she said, and then lower, "and I wasn't sure you'd believe me." "Why yesterday?" I asked. "Why did you tell me to reach out yesterday?" She looked at me. Her eyes were wet. "Because of the cake," she said. "Because I watched my mother throw away something your daughter made with her hands, and my brother just sat there and said nothing real, and I thought, she deserves to know. She deserves to walk into whatever is coming with her eyes open." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "Thank you," I said. "Now I need you to tell me everything. Every document you've seen, every name, every account, every detail you have." She reached into her bag and put a manila folder on the table. It was thick. I went home. I made lunch for Jenna. I asked her about her history project. I listened to her talk about her friend Tassity's drama with some boy from her class. And I laughed in the right places. And I was completely, entirely present for my daughter, while a completely separate part of my mind was organizing everything Reese had given me into a sequence, a strategy, a set of moves that I needed to execute carefully and in the right order. I had built an interior design business once. I understood structure. I understood that the most important part of any project is the foundation work that nobody sees before the finished thing is revealed. That evening, after Jenna went to bed, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my mother, Helen, who had been a paralegal for 22 years before she retired, and who, it turned out, had been waiting for this call for longer than I had been making it. The second was to my friend Nadine, who was a forensic accountant and who owed me a favor that I had never collected because I had never needed to before. The third was to a family law attorney named Catherine Voss, whose name I had written down 8 months ago during a moment of clarity and then shoved to the back of a drawer and tried to forget. I didn't forget. Catherine had a Saturday appointment. I took it. Here is what I understood by the end of that week. I was not a victim. Or rather, I had been positioned as one, set up to be one, but I had not yet fully become one, because I had been documenting, and I had a manila folder full of Reese's evidence, and I had 11 months of notes, and I had Nadine, who spent 4 days quietly and very illegally adjacent running numbers on every Caldwell and Associates public filing she could access. And what she found was a paper trail that was, honestly, almost insulting in its sloppiness. Preston was smart in the room. He was charming and silver-templed and commanding. He was not, it turned out, particularly smart on paper. The Phoenix LLC had been incorporated with a registered agent who was also listed on 2 other Caldwell shell entities. Sloane's name appeared as a secondary member on the holding company. Patricia's accounts, the ones Reese had identified, had received wire transfers that corresponded almost exactly to dates when Caldwell and Associates had taken on new construction financing, suggesting the money was being skimmed off the top of draws before it hit the company's operating accounts. It was not a perfect crime. It was a lazy crime, committed by people who had never seriously believed anyone would look. Because no one in this family had ever seriously believed I would look. The Saturday appointment with Catherine Voss lasted 4 hours. Catherine was 53, precise, no nonsense, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the energy of a woman who had heard every variation of this story and felt no particular sympathy for the architects of any of them. She reviewed what I had, she asked sharp questions, she requested copies of everything, and then she leaned back in her chair and said, "Jennifer, I'm going to be direct with you. You are in a strong position, but you need to move carefully, and you need to move before he does, because if he files first, he controls the narrative and the timeline." I asked her how long I had. She said, "Not long. Do you have somewhere your daughter can stay for a week that isn't connected to your husband's family?" I thought of my mother in Naperville. I thought of Helen, who had been a paralegal for 22 years and who had driven up from Naperville the moment I called and said I needed her, and who had said, without missing a beat, "Tell me what you need me to do." I told Catherine, yes. "Good," she said. "Let's build your case." What happened next took 6 weeks. I am going to tell you the shape of it, because the details belong to attorneys and court records and a process that is ongoing, but the shape is mine to share. Week 1. I moved copies of every document, Reese's folder, my 11 months of notes, the credit card statements, everything Nadine had compiled, to a secure server that Catherine's firm managed. I withdrew my personal savings from the joint account and established a separate account in my name only. I was entitled to do this. Catherine confirmed it. I did it quietly, on a Tuesday, while Preston was in a meeting. Week 2, Nadine completed her analysis and produced a formal report. She is not a forensic accountant you want producing a report about your finances if you have been skimming from your own company, because she is meticulous and relentless, and she had a personal grudge against sloppy bookkeeping that I had always found mildly endearing and was now deeply grateful for. The report was 47 pages. It was devastating. Week 3, Catherine filed. Preston came home that Thursday evening and found the papers on the kitchen island. He stood there in his coat, briefcase in hand, and read the first page, and I watched his face do something I had never seen it do before. It went uncertain, just for a second, just long enough for me to see that underneath all that silver-templed command, there was a man who had been counting on me not to know, and who now understood that I knew everything. He looked up. He said, "Jennifer?" I said, "You should call your attorney, Preston." He said, "We can talk about this." I said, "We are past talking. We are in the part where attorneys talk." He said, "You don't understand what you're doing." And I said, and I had been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, to say something like this for a very long time. I understand exactly what I'm doing. What I didn't understand was what you were doing, and now I do. He called his attorney. I took Jenna to Naperville. Patricia called me 4 times that week. I did not answer. On the 5th call, she left a voicemail that was 11 minutes long and covered, in order, shock, accusation, threats, Grief, more accusations, a revisionist history of our entire 13-year relationship, and a closing statement about how everything I had built in this city was because of the Caldwell name. I saved the voicemail. Catherine's office got a copy. Reese called me the same night. She said, "Is it done?" I said, "It started." She said, "Good. I'm filing too." Because here is what I had not known 3 weeks earlier when Reese put that manila folder on the table in the Andersonville coffee shop. She had her own attorney. She had been quietly building her own case against Preston for the financial mismanagement of the firm, the misappropriation of her dividends, and the exclusion of a minority stakeholder from material decisions. My filing and her filing, landing in the same week, created a situation that Preston's attorney described to him, I later learned from Reese, as a significant problem. I'm told he used a stronger word than significant, but I am being polished about this because this is my story, and I get to be polished when I want to be. The discovery process was what I imagined Preston had nightmares about for those 6 weeks, because Nadine's report led to a subpoena for Caldwell and Associates financial records going back 5 years, and those records told a story that went well beyond my divorce. The Scottsdale LLC, the wire transfers, the skimmed construction draws. There were people whose money had moved through those accounts who were not related to Preston or Sloan or Patricia, and when Nadine's report ended up in the hands of someone connected to 2 of those investors, the calls that started happening were not from family law attorneys. Patricia hired a crisis PR firm in week 5. I found out because they called my phone to arrange a conversation. I sent the voicemail recording to the same PR firm as a courtesy. They stopped calling. 6 weeks after the papers landed on the kitchen island, Preston agreed to a settlement framework. It was not the settlement he had planned. It was not the settlement that would have happened if I had found out about Sloan the normal way, betrayed, devastated, reactive, walking into a lawyer's office in a state of emotional chaos with nothing but hurt feelings and 13 years of marriage. It was the settlement of a woman who had been keeping notes for 11 months and who had a forensic accountant and a sister-in-law and a mother who had been a paralegal and a very precise attorney named Catherine Voss who did not tolerate sloppiness in opposing counsel. I kept the Lincoln Park house. I kept it because it was in my name. I had insisted on that at purchase, one of the only lines I had ever successfully held in this marriage, and I had held it almost unconsciously, some animal instinct I hadn't known to credit. I received a settlement that would cover Jenna's education and my own relaunch without assistance from anyone. The firm's financial irregularities were referred to investigators who were above my pay grade and not my problem to manage. Sloan was not my problem either. She had been lied to about elements of Preston's situation just as I had, and honestly, whatever she did with that information was her business. Patricia was named in Reese's civil filing and was dealing with consequences I had no need to track because I was done tracking things in that family's direction. Here is what I want to tell you about Jenna. She came home from Naperville after 2 weeks. She walked in the front door and looked around the house, the same marble counters, the same peonies I'd put out fresh, the same kitchen where she had burned her first cake and started over, and she said, "It feels different in here." I said, "It is different." She said, "Good different or bad different?" I said, "Come here." I put my arms around her, this tall, stubborn, extraordinary child who had made a 4-layer lemon cake for a woman she loved because that is the kind of person she is. And I said, "Good different, baby."
Really good different. She stood there for a second. Then she said, "Can we make another cake?" I said, "We can make anything you want." She made the cake. Same recipe, same pink frosting, favorite aunt in the same careful script. We drove it to Reese's apartment in Lakeview on a Saturday afternoon, and the 3 of us sat at Reese's little kitchen table and ate the whole thing with forks straight from the board because Reese didn't have enough plates, and we laughed until my face hurt. That is the image I carry, not the trash can, not the frosted over silence of that dining room, not Patricia's flat gray eyes or Preston's 6 calm words that split my life in two. The image I carry is my daughter's hands, still dusted in powdered sugar, passing a slice of cake to the aunt who showed up. I relaunched my interior design practice 4 months later. I named it Jenna & Co. 2 N's, yes, intentionally, because my daughter thought the extra letter was funny, and because I have decided that the things that are mine can be slightly imperfect and still be exactly right. I have 3 clients already. My rates are not apologetic. My schedule is not subject to anyone else's approval. I take every Thursday off. I don't explain it to anyone. Dr. Okafor said to me in our session last month, "You seem different." I said, "I am." She said, "What changed?" I thought about it, really thought about it. Not the events, but the actual change. The thing that had shifted somewhere between the trash can and the settlement and the cake in Reese's kitchen. And I said, I stopped waiting for someone to see me and started acting like I was already visible. She wrote that down. I thought she should. Here is the moral of this story, and I am giving it to you directly because I am done with subtlety. There are women in beautiful houses who have been so carefully, so gradually, so expertly managed that they have forgotten they were ever anything other than what someone else needed them to be. The management doesn't look like cruelty. It looks like love and structure and this is what's best and you wouldn't understand the business side and no one is going to eat it, sweetie. It is very patient, it is very thorough, and it depends completely on you never deciding to look. The day they threw my daughter's cake in the trash, something in me decided to look. Not with anger, I was past anger. With the same quiet, methodical, completely unglamorous attention to detail that I had used to document 11 months of a life that was being taken from me. I looked carefully. I wrote things down. I found people who were also looking, and then I stopped being quiet about it. Patricia Caldwell threw a child's birthday cake in the trash because she needed me distracted that day. She needed me emotional, reactive, focused on Jenna and the insult and the humiliation, not on anything else. It was the same play she had run for a decade, just louder than usual. The mistake was that this time the distraction didn't work. This time I was already watching. Preston filed a counter-motion in month 2 of the proceedings. His attorney argued that the separation of assets I had initiated was premature and adversarial. Catherine Voss responded in a brief that I was not allowed to read in full because, as she put it, some of it is spicy and I don't want you to have to perform a neutral face if he brings it up. The counter-motion was denied. I mention that only because I enjoy it. My daughter is 15 now. She wants to be a pastry chef. I told her she can be whatever she wants. I told her the only rule is that she builds it herself and doesn't let anyone tell her what people will or won't eat. She rolled her eyes at me the way 15-year-olds do when their mother is making a point that is slightly too pointed, and then she went back to her kitchen and started on a new recipe. She burned the edges. She started over. She didn't ask for help. She is mine. She has always been mine. And now, finally, this house, this life, this story, so am I.
Take a moment to comment your city or country. I love connecting with you all. Thank you for listening and supporting, and be sure to subscribe for more stories. More are coming your way soon. Until next time, stay kind to yourself and stay strong.